Marina had long noticed that something had changed in her husband. It wasn't anything obvious or loud, but these little changes had started to accumulate. He became distant. They used to talk about everything, from work to the smallest daily matters. Now, he only nodded when she started speaking. Sometimes it seemed like he didn't hear her at all. She would ask, "How's everything?" He'd reply, "Fine," and go back to his phone. He had become cold. Before, when he came home, he'd hug her first thing. Now, he avoided physical contact. Marina could feel his hands pulling away from her. It was all so unnatural that she began to worry. But what alarmed her the most was his constant tardiness. He came home late in the evenings, as if something important was holding him back. She couldn't imagine what could be keeping him. It wasn't work. He had been in a senior position for a long time, working regular hours from 9 to 6. Why was he late? Marina began to ask herself questions. The scent of another woman's perfume. That was the last thing that made her think something was wrong. At first, she didn't pay attention to it, but over time she realized. He started bringing home that scent, faint, delicate, but definitely not hers. He had always been careful about things like that. He wouldn't accidentally forget his cologne. But now, no matter how carefully he tried, her nose caught it. And with each day, the scent grew more noticeable. Along with the perfume, there were text messages. She didn't go looking for them, but one day, when she grabbed his phone to see if he had left in the bathroom, she saw strange messages. There were casual exchanges, but as she scrolled down, she stumbled on a couple lines that made her heart race. "I want you. See you soon." These weren't regular messages from colleagues or friends. Something was definitely wrong. She stood in the bathroom, clutching the phone, feeling her head spin. But instead of causing a scene, she decided to stay silent. Marina wasn't one to shout. She had always been the kind of woman who preferred to think before acting. She watched him closely, noticed how he behaved, what he said, who he met. He didn't give her specific reasons to suspect anything, but her gut was screaming that her instincts weren't lying. It seemed like a turning point had come in their relationship. She noticed how he'd become nervous when she suddenly asked questions about his work schedule or when she accidentally touched his hand. He'd say he was just busy, that he had a tough day at work. But every time he left work, his face became cold, his gaze distant, nothing like it used to be. Then one day, everything changed. That evening, she waited for him as usual. After spending the night in the kitchen reading a book and feeling lonely, she heard the key turning in the door. He came in, followed by a girl. She was about 18, with long hair, wearing jeans and a trendy jacket. She looked completely out of place here, in their home. Marina froze in place, not believing her eyes. Her husband, noticing her, said quietly but firmly, "Meet Lyra. She's staying with us for a couple of days. She has nowhere to go." Marina couldn't say a word. Her chest tightened, but on the outside, she stayed calm. She breathed steadily, as though nothing had happened. She looked at the girl and saw nothing but naivete and confidence in her eyes, as if she had already been part of this home. Marina silently nodded, and while her husband led Lyra into the room, she went to her own bedroom and closed the door behind her. She didn't cause a scene. She just decided that it was time to act differently. Marina couldn't believe her eyes. A strange girl in her house. She stood in the doorway, staring at Lyra like she was a foreigner. But instead of crying or shouting, as she might have done a few years ago, she simply nodded and stepped aside. Her husband, as if nothing had happened, led Lyra into the living room, showing her where everything was, as if she had always been part of their life. "Here's your room," he said, pointing to one of the rooms. "Marina, it's fine. Let her stay for a few days. It's important to help people in tough times." Marina, not lifting her head, replied with a simple, "Okay," and that was the end of the conversation. The girl, as if on cue, seemed completely unfazed, flashing a silly smile. She sat in the chair, tossed her hair around like everything around her was her world, and her husband and Marina, were just background noise in her life. At first glance, it was clear she had nowhere to go, but as soon as she sat in their living room, she began to act like the hostess. She browsed the books on the shelf, admired the paintings on the walls, and with every movement, Marina felt more and more out of place. Lyra even found Marina's favorite chair and, without hesitation, claimed it as if it were her own. "Wow, this robe is nice," Lyra remarked, holding up one of Marina's old robes. Marina, without turning around, replied, "Yeah, I bought it a long time ago. So soft, right? And it smells so nice, like perfume," Lyra continued. Marina threw a quick glance at her, but didn't say a word. Her heart started to beat faster at those words, but she held herself together. All the while, her husband, seemingly oblivious to what was going on, calmly sipped his tea and chatted with Lyra. He didn't even try to explain why she was there or what was happening. The conversation was simply about how she would sleep, what her preferences were, and if everything was okay. Marina found comfort in silence. She didn't let her emotions show, no matter how much her heart was tearing apart. Every word Lyra said, every movement she made, every sentence that came from her husband's mouth, ripped her apart inside. But she remained cold. After lunch, when Lyra had gone to her room, Marina finally decided to tend to the house. But her mind kept returning to what was happening. Every tiny movement Lyra made, every look her husband gave her, seemed to be etched into her mind. With each hour, Lyra became more at home, and Marina felt more and more like she was losing her claim to it all. She noticed how Lyra used her things, as if she had no respect for boundaries. In the evening, when Marina went back into the kitchen, she saw Lyra standing in front of the mirror, sorting through her perfumes. She didn't ask for permission. She just did it, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Marina watched her in the mirror and felt a chill run through her. Her husband sat in his chair, engrossed in reading the newspaper, as though he didn't notice anything. It was like he was living in a parallel reality where everything was fine. He didn't see how Lyra was going through her things. He didn't see the pain in Marina's heart. He didn't notice how with each passing hour, she felt more and more like a stranger in her own home. When night came and Lyra went to her room, Marina headed to the bedroom but couldn't sleep. Every touch from her husband felt alien. Once again, he didn't look her in the eyes, and his body felt cold and distant. But instead of crying, she closed her eyes and sank into her thoughts. But that night, when everything quieted down, she heard soft laughter. It came from the bedroom, where her husband was supposed to be sleeping. Lyra's laughter. Quiet, carefree laughter that continued to echo in her ears as she lay in her bed, too afraid to get up. Marina froze. The laughter seemed so familiar, yet so foreign. It was intimate. Their laughter, the laughter of two people who had just enjoyed each other's company. Her husband was laughing with Lyra, and she, Marina, was in the next room, completely left out of everything. Marina turned onto her side and closed her eyes, but the laughter kept ringing in her ears, tearing her apart. She could feel the fury creeping up inside her. But what could she do? Scream? All she could do was take in that moment, like a new entry in her diary, the laughter that shattered her peace. Every day became more unbearable for Marina. She could understand when her home had turned into a stranger's place, and when her life had become so unreal. Since Lyra stepped into their home, Marina stopped being the mistress of her own house. She became a shadow. All the space that once was her world had now filled with something foreign, cold like an icy wind. She noticed how Lyra, as if not noticing her, flirted with her husband. It was blatant. Sometimes, Marina would catch them exchanging looks, and those glances held something far too intimate for strangers. He laughed at her jokes, looked at her when she walked into the room, even started mimicking her mannerisms. Lyra handled them like subjects. She sat at the table, moved Marina's favorite books around, wore her robe, and her husband remained silent as if she had disappeared. Marina could feel how her role in the house was rapidly changing. She had once been his wife, supportive and loving, but now, just a shadow, with a place at the table like a servant. Sometimes, she couldn't believe she was living in this house. She had lost her value. She wasn't needed here anymore. All that kept her here were memories of how they once laughed, how everything used to be easy and clear. And now, everything was crumbling. The neighbors started whispering, Of course. How could they not? They used to come to parties. Marina used to cook dinners. But now, she noticed their looks, how they tried not to look her way. They'd talk behind her back. Yeah. Did you see who came to visit them? A girl with her husband. Guess she's not much of a wife after all. And that wasn't all. In the evenings, when they sat at the table, Marina could no longer hide her pain. Lyra babbled about something completely irrelevant, and her husband, as usual, sat silently drinking. He wasn't interested in her opinion anymore. He avoided her gaze as if she no longer existed. He didn't notice how she was slowly ceasing to be a part of his life. Lyra behaved as if she wasn't just a guest but the hostess. And at some point, Marina realized that all she was doing was observing. But observing was no longer possible. Instead of tears and hysterics, instead of rushing into her husband's arms with screams and accusations, an idea began to form in Marina's mind. She became silent, cold, and composed. Instead of giving into emotions, she started analyzing every move he made, every word he said, every detail. If Lyra was so confident here, if her husband no longer looked at her, if the neighbors were gossiping about their relationship, then it was time to change the course of the game. She began to do everything quietly, unnoticed by those around her. She recorded everything that happened, but not to take revenge, but to start acting differently. One day, after Lyra went to her room and her husband once again buried himself in his phone, Marina decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. She quietly walked into the hallway and listened. At her words, her husband began to laugh. Lyra joined in, and the laughter seemed so intimate that Marina's heart clenched. But then she heard something. That old fool doesn't understand that it's all over. She thought he loved her. Ha! She doesn't see how you're pulling me toward you. Those words were the last straw. Lyra's words, her gaze, her confidence. It was all a response to all the years of their relationship. He was her husband, but she wasn't even a valuable person to him. She had become disposable. It was too cruel. A shadow. That's what she had become to him. And suddenly something inside her clicked. She stood in the hallway, her chest tight with resentment. But in that moment, something changed. A feeling she hadn't felt in years stirred within her. It was a feeling of power. Now she understood that she had everything she needed to change their life. And if he so easily stopped noticing her, if Lyra openly humiliated her, then she could play her own game. Marina returned to her room and closed the door behind her with a quiet motion. In her mind, a clear understanding of what would come next began to take shape. Now she could act. This thought gave her strength. And despite the pain she had just endured, she felt a spark igniting inside her. It was a spark of revenge. But she was ready to play by her own rules. And this path would be hers alone. Marina sat in the kitchen, watching as her husband returned home, as he always did, late. He took off his coat, tossed it over a chair, and immediately headed for the fridge. No apologies, no attempts to make up for anything. He simply came back into the house, as if everything were normal, as if nothing had changed. She sat silently, watching him. His face was tired but calm. He didn't notice her gaze. He walked past her, without even looking her way. Marina was absolutely sure that this moment had to come. She couldn't keep up her silence anymore. She couldn't be the woman who endured. She had always been there for him, supported him, built a life with him. But now he was tearing her apart as if she meant nothing. When he returned to the room, she approached him and stopped him, not letting him pass. "Are you sleeping with her?" Marina asked, not shouting, not gasping for air, just quietly, coldly. She had been ready to hear this answer for a long time. He froze, his body tensing. He hadn't expected such a question. He paused for a moment, and then Marina knew he would be honest like never before. "Yes," he said, not meeting her gaze. "Sorry, but I'm a living person, Marina. I need to feel wanted. I can't live the way you've locked me in a cage." Marina stood in front of him, motionless. The moment when her heart should have shattered, when the tears should have flowed, none of that happened. She didn't feel any pain, no fear. All she felt was emptiness. But it wasn't the emptiness of loss. It was the emptiness of knowing that he had betrayed her. And in that moment, She realized she didn't need his pity. She didn't need to cry, didn't need to search for explanations in his eyes. Because for her, everything had already been decided. She didn't answer him. She just quietly smiled. She wasn't going to forgive him. She wasn't going to fight him. All she wanted was for him to think that everything was fine, for him to continue believing that it would all blow over. This was his mistake. He hadn't realized she was already playing her own game. He stood there, unsure what to do. He expected her to be upset, to shout, to tell him that he had ruined everything. But instead, she remained silent. He stood in front of her like someone who had lost all their value, as though she had disappeared. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked, finally noticing how tense his posture had become. "You knew I was no longer your wife. You knew I wouldn't be your shadow when you brought her here." He didn't say a word. He dropped his gaze. "You were wrong," she added quietly, not looking at him anymore. "You thought everything would be okay. You thought I would put up with it, that it could be forgotten, but I'm not like that. I'm going to learn to live differently." He stood in front of her, but no longer knew how to react. He was stunned, not understanding what was happening, what game she had started. After all, he had done everything the way he thought was right. He was sure it didn't matter. But now, it was clear that he was wrong. And now it was too late. Marina didn't wait for his response. She wasn't the woman who cried in his arms anymore. She wasn't the woman who let him dictate the terms. She was someone else. And she was going to do whatever it took to prove to herself and to him that she wasn't lost. Later, when he went to his room, she stood up and headed for the bedroom. Closing the door behind her, she went to the closet. At that moment, her hands didn't tremble and her gaze was firm. She pulled out the documents, all the papers she had hidden in the far corner. Her eyes scanned them, and she already knew what she would do. This was the beginning of her plan. Not tomorrow, not in a week. Right now, that night, Marina began laying the groundwork to take back her life. Just like she had once believed in love, now she believed in herself. Marina couldn't sit idly by anymore. She knew that over the years of living with her husband, so many things had remained unclear, and now the time had come to act. If, in the past, she had been the woman who simply believed in love and trusted her husband, now she was faced with a different reality, a reality where she needed to act with a clear head and scrutinize every step. And this moment had been long in the making. Everything would start with the documents. She couldn't remember the last time she tried to figure out who owned their apartment, whose name was on their accounts, how the payments were handled. She had been so sure that her husband had taken care of it all. He said everything was under control. She never got involved. But now, feeling lost in her own home, she needed answers to these questions. Marina started with the apartment. She quietly checked who was registered, who the owner was, and who signed the purchase agreement. It never even occurred to her that her husband could be hiding something. She checked the documents, only to realize she wasn't listed as a full co-owner. The apartment was solely in his name. A thought sparked in her mind. How could this be? Why? Why had she trusted him without ever checking? And now, sitting at the table, going through the papers, she felt a surge of anger rising within her. The next step was to go through their tax declarations. She found old tax documents, all the things her husband had kept hidden from her. He always told her he handled it, that she shouldn't worry. But now, in light of the truth, every document became significant. He hadn't just been hiding things from her. He had been manipulating her. In the tax declarations, there were many empty spots, discrepancies in expenses, hidden amounts, overpayments. She knew that with these figures, she could suspect something illegal. This didn't look like a coincidence. It was a delicate game in which she had simply been a pawn. Then she checked the mortgage. How long had it been since they took out the loan? How had the loan for the house been arranged? All of this had been hidden behind layers of false reassurances. Marina moved on to her next task, going through the bank statements. With each moment, with each document, she felt herself losing more and more trust in the person who had once been her partner. Instead of tears and pain, she was filled with only a sense of emptiness, which soon turned into determination. For the first time in years, she began reading legal forums. They discussed various scams, hidden debts, and legal mistakes. She was surprised at how many people had found themselves in such situations. Why hadn't she figured it out sooner? Why had she trusted him? With each piece of advice she read, she grew stronger and more confident in her abilities. What she hadn't known before was now clear. In every legal rule, she saw her steps and understood that there was a way out. And this way out began with the documents. She didn't realize how many hours she spent in front of the computer, checking everything and writing down the details. At first, she worried that her husband might notice her actions, but soon she realized that he didn't notice anything. He continued living his life as if nothing had changed. He thought everything had passed, and he remained in his usual role. He didn't notice how she was starting to take steps that would lead to his downfall. Meanwhile, Marina continued to observe Lyra. One day, she overheard a conversation that completely changed her perspective on the situation. Lyra, it seemed, was sure she was safe. She thought Marina's husband would protect her, but this was the moment when Marina overheard words that wouldn't let her rest. Everything's under control. He won't be on your side. He won't risk it. You're his savior, and she's just a shadow. Marina froze when she heard those words. It was a moment when she realized that Lyra wasn't just using her husband. She was manipulating him, and he didn't even realize it. Those words, "She's just a shadow," were her signal. This wasn't just betrayal. It was something deeper. Now Marina knew how to use this information. She felt power growing inside her. That night, Marina made a decision that would change everything. She was no longer a victim. She was going to play by her own rules. Marina couldn't forget the conversation she had overheard. Lyra's words haunted her. "You're just a shadow." Those words, spoken with such arrogance, made her feel like she had been deceived not only by her husband and Lyra, but by life itself. Each day, Marina felt her world crumbling, and it only fueled her determination. She continued to analyze everything that was happening, gathering information. And then, at one point, she realized that she didn't know a single real fact about Lyra. The girl who had moved into her house and was acting so confidently didn't leave a trace of her real life, nor any sign of her family. Where had she been born? Who were her parents? Why was she so young, yet so sure of herself? So many questions, and there were no answers. Marina decided to dig deeper. She found a few old social media profiles that Lyra had once used, but everything was locked. Strange. Ordinary girls always leave traces on the internet, even old photos. But Lyra didn't have a single trace from her childhood. No school pictures, no memories. Marina began to suspect that Lyra might not be who she claimed to be. But she couldn't stop at mere speculation. She needed to know everything. Her intuition told her that Lyra wasn't just hiding the details of her life. She was hiding her very identity. Marina decided to take control of the situation. Soon, she found several of Lyra's phones, one of which was linked to her bank cards. When she called one of them, she heard a voice that didn't belong to a girl. It was a man's voice, not even trying to hide his identity. At that moment, Marina realized that Lyra wasn't who she had claimed to be. She decided to find some documents that would prove her identity. And finally, in one of the old suitcases in Lyra's room, she discovered documents that shattered everything she had understood. The first thing that caught her eye, fake documents. Passports, driver's licenses, and other forms of identification, but with clearly incorrect dates and names. She looked at Lyra's passport. The name listed in it didn't match the one Lyra had given. When Marina compared the information with what she had found online, she realized that this document had no legal standing. Lyra didn't exist in reality. She was a fake person with fake documents. But the scariest discovery awaited her at the end. Lyra wasn't 18 as she had claimed. Marina found a birth certificate stating that Lyra was barely 17. She was a minor, but with fake documents that allowed her to live an adult life, stay in another person's home, and manipulate her husband. It was too much. Marina felt a bubbling rage inside her. She couldn't allow this girl to stay in her home and continue destroying her family. But what could she do with this knowledge? Whatever action she took, it had to be careful. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Lyra wasn't just a rival, she was a threat. Marina knew that now she had information that could change everything. She no longer thought about staying silent or letting it all blow over. She decided to act, and she would act with maximum force. That night, when her husband left the house again, Marina sat at her computer. She knew she had to move fast. She wrote an anonymous report to the authorities, pointing out that a minor with fake documents was staying in her house, acting suspiciously and possibly involved in criminal activity. She left all the necessary evidence for the police to start an investigation quickly. Lyra, who thought everything was under control, would soon feel the consequences. But now, it wasn't just her house anymore, it was her last mistake. Marina bit her lip and hit send. Now that it was done, all she could do was wait. Marina knew not to rush things. She understood that there would come a moment when her husband would feel the consequences of what he had done. But that moment still took him by surprise. He didn't expect his life to change so suddenly. It all started the day he returned home, just like always, looking a little nervous. He came into the apartment, and as soon as he stepped through the door, his phone rang. Marina stood in the hallway, watching his face change. He quickly grabbed the phone and stepped into the corner, trying to speak quietly but nervously. After a few minutes, he returned to the room, even more confused than before. "I can't believe this," he muttered, standing in front of her. "Marina, what have you done?" He tried to stay calm, but it was obvious his words were a form of justification. Marina remained silent, not hurrying to respond. "I've been reported," he continued. "Our accounts have been frozen. The money is blocked. We're blacklisted. You like this, don't you? You set all of this up, didn't you?" Marina simply nodded. She didn't feel guilty. This was the logical consequence of what had happened to their relationship, to their life. He had destroyed everything, and now she was just collecting the remnants of it. "You do understand this isn't just a coincidence, right? This isn't something random." She finally spoke, her voice calm, emotionless. "You thought everything could be hidden, that things would go back to how they were. But it's not like that. Everything comes full circle, and you can't avoid it." His face turned pale. He looked at her, unsure how to react. He tried to find words, but none came. All he could do was stare at her, realizing that he couldn't fix this. He had expected her to be upset, to shout, to demand explanations. But instead, she was silent. He stood in front of her as if she was someone completely different, someone who had no interest in him anymore. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked, noticing how tense his posture had become. "You knew I was no longer your wife. You knew I wouldn't be your shadow once you brought her here." He didn't say a word. He lowered his gaze. "You were wrong," she added quietly, no longer looking at him. "You thought everything would be fine. You thought I would put up with it, that it could be forgotten. But I'm not like that. I'm going to learn to live differently." He stood in front of her, still not knowing what to do. He was stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening, what game she had started. After all, he had done everything as he thought was right. He was sure it didn't matter. But now it was clear that he was wrong. And now it was too late. Marina didn't wait for his response. She wasn't the woman who would cry in his arms anymore. She wasn't the woman who let him dictate the rules. She was someone else now, and she was going to do whatever it took to prove to herself and to him that she wasn't lost. Later, when he went to his room, she stood up and headed to her bedroom. Closing the door behind her, she walked to the closet. Her hands didn't tremble, and her gaze was steady. She took out the documents, all the papers she had been hiding in the far corner. Her eyes scanned them, and she already knew what she would do. This was the beginning of her plan. Not tomorrow, not in a week. Right now, that night, Marina began laying the groundwork to take back her life. Just like she once believed in love, now she believed in herself. Lyra disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. The day Marina came home, she found that Lyra's things and all traces of her presence had vanished. There was no note, no goodbye. It was as if Lyra had never lived in the house. The only thing left behind was the empty space that now seemed even heavier. Marina stood at the threshold of Lyra's room for a long time, trying to understand what it all meant. Why had she just left? Why didn't she say goodbye? And, more importantly, what would happen to her husband now? He was left alone, with hands full of debts, with his lost dignity. Marina knew that for him, everything had ended. Lyra had gone, but he was left with nothing. And so, that evening, he returned home again. But now his face was not the same as she had known it. It was unrecognizable. There was no confidence in his eyes. There was not even the pain he might have felt after losing his family. All that showed was despair. He stood in the hallway, like a man thrown out onto the street, and remained silent. Marina, without turning around, heard his footsteps. He approached her, but didn't dare enter the room. His face was marked with exhaustion, and she realized that now he didn't know how to approach her. Her calmness was like a wall he couldn't break through. "Marina," his voice trembled. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I ruined everything. You mean so much to me, and I know I've lost you. Please forgive me. I was blind." She continued to sit. She didn't lift her head, didn't react. He sank to his knees in front of her. She could feel his desperation as he reached for her, wanting to take everything back. But she wasn't the same woman who had cried in his arms. She didn't believe his words, didn't believe in his sincerity. All she felt was emptiness. "Did you think I was weak?" she finally said, her voice firm, without the slightest trace of doubt. "You were wrong. I was just patient." He looked at her, his eyes filling with tears. He started to say something about pain and regret, but she wasn't listening. She already knew that his words meant nothing. How many times had he told her things would be different? How many times had she forgiven him for big and small mistakes? But now, at this moment, everything became clear. He stopped being her husband the moment he brought another woman into their home, when he forced her to face the truth. Everything they had was gone. He was no longer her husband. He was just a stranger in her house. And in that moment, his awareness began to fail him. Marina stood up and walked past him, not looking his way. She headed for the window, staring into the darkness outside, as though trying to see her own freedom in the night sky. "You can apologize as much as you want," she continued, "but I don't believe you anymore. You broke what we had. And now, when you're left alone, you're starting to realize it." He remained sitting on the floor, unsure how to respond. He couldn't understand her. He thought she would return to him, that everything would go back to the way it was. But he was mistaken. He thought his words would be enough to bring her love back. But he didn't understand that his destruction began not with Lyra, but with the moment he started losing her. Marina walked past him, her steps firm, as she made her way to the door. Without a word, she left the room, leaving him in the silence of his own failure. Later, when Marina returned to her room and sat on the bed, her phone vibrated. It was a call. She didn't hesitate and picked it up. On the other end was his drunken voicemail. "You destroyed me," he sobbed, his words slurred. "You left me with nothing. You ruined everything. How could you?" Marina listened to his voice, but she didn't feel pity or anger, only calm. She knew he deserved this. She couldn't allow herself to be weak. She couldn't pity him, no matter how much pain he had caused her. And with a light, almost invisible smile, she replied, "I didn't even touch you." She hung up, not giving him a chance to continue. Everything had been said. There was no room for emotions anymore. He had backed himself into a corner, and now he had to face reality. Marina was ready for it. She was no longer the woman who endured. She was a woman who now controlled her own life, and his life was no longer a part of her path. She sat in silence, watching her world change. There was a sense that now, everything was starting anew. She was free again. Marina sat in the kitchen, looking out the window, reflecting on how much had changed over the last few months. She never expected that one day her life, filled with so much pain and betrayal, would become light and free. But here she was, finally in the place she had always wanted to be, alone, but free from fear and deception. Life without her husband in the house had become something completely different. All those things that had once been familiar and painful now became part of her new world. She had renovated the apartment, not just updating the walls, but creating a space that had become her refuge. Everything in the house spoke of her. Every corner was shaped down to the finest details, leaving no room for outsiders. She had changed her phone number, thrown out the old things, and stopped wearing the suits and outfits he liked. Instead, her closet was now filled with clothes that spoke to her new beginning. This was herself, without limits, without deception. New perfumes. She picked them out carefully because they were another step towards change. When she wore them, she could feel the old leaving, making room for the new. Now, her days were filled with simple things, but they were so important. She spent time in cafes with her friends, traveled to cities she had always dreamed of visiting. She had learned to appreciate the silence she used to fear. She had learned to be with herself. One evening, after a long day, Marina came home, took off her shoes, turned on the soft lights, and walked to the mirror. She stood there for a while, looking at her reflection, as though seeing herself for the first time in a long time. She looked at herself and realized that she didn't need anyone else anymore. No more justifications. No more worrying about what he might say or think. She was herself. She was free. And in that moment, when the light reflected in her eyes, Marina smiled. It wasn't just a smile. It was a genuine smile. Open, sincere, not because she was gaining something, but because she was truly herself. She felt all her fears leave her, and inside, a light began to shine that no one could ever ignite. She didn't feel the thirst for revenge anymore. Revenge wasn't always a scream or an act. Revenge was when you no longer expected anything from other people. When you didn't need their regrets, their forgiveness, or their approval. When you were enough for yourself. Revenge wasn't showing strength. It was continuing to live your life calmly when everything was already over. Marina looked around her apartment. Everything was in its place. Everything she had done was for her. And in that moment, she felt peace. She knew that there was no pain that could keep her in the past. She had set herself free, and this new chapter was hers alone. Revenge isn't a scream. It's when you no longer expect anything and you feel at peace, she said aloud, smiling at her reflection. And in that moment, she understood that she would never look back. Marina was no longer the woman who searched for justifications for others. She was a woman who had found herself, and in that was her true happiness.